Great. I'm Jacquel Hajder. Welcome to the 10 o'clock panel here. We've got a whole crew of gentlemen here ready to speak with you. My name is Jacquel Hajder. I oversee economic development for Anoka County through an economic development partnership there. We work with the private developers, we work with the cities to help develop land in the county, also help with redevelopment. So my role today is to kind of walk you through the state of industrial and development with all these gentlemen. So I'm going to start off by going around this panel and letting them take a couple minutes to explain, what they've been working on in this year and introduce themselves. So I'll start with Josh here.
I'm Josh Budish. I'm Vice President of Leasing Development for Duke Realty Corporation here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. We have about 5.1 million square feet of Class A industrial in town. This year has mainly been focused on that. We have two really nice land positions, both in the Northwest, Park 81 and Arbor Lakes, and probably more excited about next year than this year. So to be continued.
You and me both. Phil, do you want to go ahead?
Good morning, everyone. Phil Cattanach with Opus. I'm the Vice President and General Manager for the Twin Cities office, and our area kind of extends down to our office down in Des Moines, as well as down in Nebraska and the Dakotas. So as Opus, we're a multidisciplinary developer. So I know today we're going to be focusing on industrial, but we have been very active also in the student housing, multifamily, senior, limited office, and even sometimes some retail space. So the industrial market has certainly been maybe one of the shining stars throughout the uncharted times of 2020. And I'm not going to sit here and say it's been a record year, but I also would turn on and say, had it not been for that product diversity that we enjoy at Opus, I think it could have been a real tough year for us. However, the industrial continues to be that kind of common denominator that continues to thrive. And I'm excited to talk about some of the projects that we've been able to execute in the pre and current and eventual post-pandemic world.
You're kind of a Renaissance man, aren't you?
I have to keep reinventing myself. I keep saying maybe I'm no good at anything, so I keep finding something I can finally be good at.
I'm Paul Hyde with Hyde Development. Our focus is on industrial. We're active in Minneapolis and Fargo and some big project in Denver. We'll talk about it in a minute, but excited to talk about industrial today.
Thanks, Paul. How's it going over there, Jeff? Just keeps getting further and further down the line.
It's going well. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for everyone joining remotely, and for those of you that are still here on this cold November Friday morning. And I don't think anyone's actually mentioned that today is actually Friday the 13th, 2020. So let's see where this goes. But my name is Jeff Gears. I'm the Vice President of Architecture at BDH. For those familiar, BDH is an interior design and architecture firm in the Twin Cities. I have about 20 years experience. BDH has been around for about 40 years. And we work primarily on three market sectors, that being healthcare, multifamily, and what we call workplace. And for us, workplace is in part, a big part of that is industrial. We think about if that's, that be manufacturing, warehousing, or distribution, there are people that are working in those environments. And that has been a big focus of my career. And so as it relates to the state of industrial development, as an architect, I might have a little bit different perspective than some of the other people on the panel. But I can say that what I've been seeing is actually in direct alignment with one of our core values at BDH, and it's about the people. And right now, we're certainly living in really interesting times if nobody's noticed. And, there's certainly some uncertainty, there's concerns, there's fears. And for us, we're seeing that in terms of the amount of opportunities that are surfacing. But we're also seeing something that actually I think is a good thing, and that is companies are taking the time to really invest energies on what they could be doing better, specifically for their people. And so as that relates to what we're working on, we're not seeing quite as much speculative work, but we are seeing more build-to-suit, ground-up type work. And that build-to-suit tends to be maybe a little bit smaller, more in regards to manufacturing, and at one other point. and more infill. So, we're going to be talking about potential sites, and I think it will be a good conversation to.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. And Brady, tell him here on my redheaded stepchild on
Yeah,
on
down
the
here
corner.
at the kids' table. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. These guys are all familiar to you. I'm sure I'm a bit of a new face. So I had some slides. Todd, I don't know if we've got them keyed up, but I promise I'll fly through them.
You did your homework.
Engineer, I can't help it. That's correct, Sambatek. So I'm Brady Busselman, civil engineer and practice leader of the commercial group at Sambatek. We're a multidisciplinary consulting firm, engineering, surveying, planning, environmental and landscape architecture. We're based out of Minnetonka. We just opened an office though in Dallas, which we're very excited about, especially during the winter like we're going into now. I've got a little bit of a word salad on there with capabilities. We'll talk about that. I don't need to read everything to you guys. I'll spare you. But I will say with the commercial group that I lead, they're 12 plus or minus engineers, landscape architects, and technicians. We cover what we consider, I guess, commercial in the private area, which is basically everything but multifamily. So that's everything but single family. It is multifamily. Retail, senior housing, office, and industrial. So, and speaking of industrial, we were talking internally about this. We could go to the next slide, Todd, and try to get a pulse on what volume of current projects we have. And for us, that's anything that's starting out in concept all the way to active construction. We came up with a list of over 3.5 million square feet active in the metro area. Now, what does that mean to you? I'd say take about 1 million of this out and say that's construction that's being delivered currently. And then, some of these are what I would call, and I'm trying to invent a new category because we get on so early in these, they're not really spec yet. They're not really built to suit yet. They're more hypothetical or tweeners. I guess they haven't gotten developed to the point where they're being planned for construction, so to speak. But I would say it's by far, we don't keep stats like this, but by far I'd say we feel it's the strongest year for us right now, industrial wise. And if we could flip to the next one, quick visual of a project just to give you a sense of type of work. This is a Houseek Business Park in Chanhassen, about 400,000 square feet, just came online this year. This one I'd say, I think Steve mentioned earlier, sprinkle the ground, and 6 months later you have a building. This was about really more of a 2-year process, and really you can sprinkle the ground once we get out of the way, and then you can get the building up and built. This one's very interesting. I've been kicked around a lot, but some of the challenges that we were wrestling with here are a couple wetlands with Army Corps, MPCA, and city jurisdictions to navigate. Lift station, we're right next to Chaska. They had sewer that was low enough, but they said, we don't want your ish. And we're in Chanhassen, so we had to pump it back up the hill. Gas pipeline right down the middle of the site, as well as just deep deposits of peat soils. So very interesting site. And I think these guys will probably tell you, if an engineer tells you it's interesting, you might want to run the other way or start looking at some dollar signs. And then last slide here, real briefly, another one that we're proud of. We worked with Phil on here in Cottage Grove is renewal by Anderson, 350,000 square foot build to suit, 100,000 square foot addition, open this year. This will be the opposite, and kudos to the previous group. This is the type of project that cities really set the stage for, because this was a shovel-ready project with a city that welcomed it with fairly open arms, I guess, from my perspective. And with that, I think I've nattered on enough. We'll get to the good stuff. Looking forward to talking with these guys.
Thanks, Brady. And I think Brady kind of jumped a little ahead and showed you some of the projects. That's really the state of industrial, right? What's going on. So let's jump back to Josh and say, we're seeing some projects. We're hearing industrials, obviously, still we'll call it a renaissance this year and doing well. But that doesn't mean it hasn't shifted a little bit in 2020. So what have you seen with Duke, and what are you planning for next year in terms of projects?
So we're planning on going spec at our Park 81 site in Maple Grove back in February. And when COVID hit in March, we decided to press pause. I think had we built it, it would have done just fine. I think we'd possibly even have it filled by now. That whole area has really tightened up in the last few months. In fact, the projects that had just delivered or were under construction, where everyone was nervous in March and April, did very well. So we're gearing up to start another building there next spring. But we, being not just a developer, but one of the largest owners in town, we really just focus on our core portfolio. And happy to say now we're about 98% occupied. 100% of our rent is in. We are not having conversations with any of our tenants about rent relief at this time. So we really feel like that's well behind us. Now, is there another spike coming or shutdown that may change that? Maybe, but we feel really good about where things are at. And as far as what we have planned next year, it's the same product type, same sites. Obviously, things like last mile are getting more and more popular amongst the online retailers, not just Amazon, but others too. But we've been seeing a lot of growth in the build-to-suit for headquarters with office, light manufacturing, and warehouse. We've seen DC requirements, really almost everything across the board within the industrial sector.
Thank you, Josh. And Phil, what about you? What have you seen this year and at least your portfolio that you're trying to manage, and what are you planning for next year?
Certainly. So I think, unlike maybe Duke, Opus, we're a merchant developer. So maybe said another way, we utilize our balance sheet to develop projects, stabilize them, and then sell them upon stabilization. And presuming we do it right, then we can get our money back out and we can redeploy that capital into the next project. So while we don't necessarily, our objective is not to have a sizable portfolio. We also are patient enough to allow for the market to respond when things are right. And I'll maybe use that in a more tangible sense of saying we were moving right along, continuing with both spec and build-to-suit pursuits at the start of 2020. And admittedly, March, April, I don't want to say there was a pause, but I think we just said, we don't know where the valuations of buildings are going to go right now. And look, at the end of the day, if you have a building started or you're a proud owner of a site, you either continue going or you put the pause on. If you're under construction, I'd challenge you to say probably putting a pause at that point could be difficult. But by way of example, we had a project that we acquired, a property, I should say, in the Golden Triangle in Eden Prairie that we acquired at the very first of the year. And we were all set to go. And March, April came along and we said, well, maybe we need to take a small pause. But we elected to go ahead and proceed. And if you drove by the site today, you'd see 130,000 square feet of spec industrial that's up, that's unsubscribed at the moment, or as I like to say, it's unencumbered by any leases at the moment. But then on the flip side, we had two build-to-suits, one that we work with Chris Warrens down in Owatonna for Bosch, and another one locally here in Shakopee for a group called Cherney. And both of those deals were in a pre-COVID negotiation phase, and we ended up signing those leases and commencing those build-to-suits right in kind of the middle of COVID. I'm not going to sit here and insult anyone's intelligence that did COVID have an influence on the timing? Absolutely. But did it undermine the business thesis of these groups that, were deemed essential? They've been working every single day. No, they still needed the physical space. And while we let some of that turbulence in the market maybe work through the uncertainty, those are still up. And as we speak, those are both going. So we found that 2020, particularly on the industrial, probably had for our business model, had a little bit of a pause for maybe kind of that Q2 of 2020. But as we sit here today, our inventory of industrial in this market is limited to that Golden Triangle project that I referenced earlier that isn't even done yet. So we have found, to Josh's point, that by continuing forward, we were right, wrong, or indifferent. I think we benefited by the limited amount of supply that was coming online and the ongoing demands for tenants looking for larger blocks of contiguous space that in the markets that we have product in, Egan and Arbor Lakes, up in Maple Grove, there just wasn't a lot of space. Josh's in Maple Grove, they're our biggest competitor right now for blocks of space, but I can say that we have nothing really of size to offer at this point because we've been successful in our lease up. Same thing in Egan. There's just not a lot of blocks of space right now. If you want 50,000 square feet of contiguous space, I don't know if it exists in 32-foot clear, and that's a heavier distribution, three-party PL type market. So, and I see looking forward to 2021, we are actively out there looking for both that combination of infill industrial sites that we will go spec or potentially a build to suit if our timing works out right, as well as continue to have strong land positions. The previous panel talked, I mean, we're working with the city of Rosemont and the University of Minnesota for a property. We have a property of 170 acres that, we are continually out there searching for those larger requirements that just candidly don't have the physical space in the infill locations. So that's our strategy for 21 is to continue to accelerate all of the momentum that we see coming out of 20 in the industrial space.
So Phil, you kind of touched on something I think Paul can jump right on is the infill discussion. We had chatted, this group and I, before today to kind of prep, and we talked about what your struggles are, especially with infill, what's been the challenge in finding good sites to get a project done. So Paul, maybe you want to switch gears a little bit and talk about, what you've been working on and what your barriers are to finding infill sites that work.
Yeah, that's great. I'll make a first comment on how we've seen COVID affect the industrial market, and then that ties into the infill. So I would say we lost one tenant at Stacks. We had a couple, let's say we had 5 requests for rent relief. One deserved it. The others just had their hand out. One a public company that said we need rent abated for the rest of the year. So we looked up their quarterly public financial statements where they disclosed they had several hundreds of millions of dollars stashed away, and we're very confident that they could make it through the year with all their lease obligations. So I highlighted that and just emailed it back, said, you're good. We did have one tenant that tipped over. They did kids shows. They were called V-Star, owned by Cirque du Soleil. They couldn't have shows. They literally ran out of business. But what we've seen since then, as we're looking to backfill that space, we've got 10 prospects for that space from 50 to 100,000 feet.
Yeah.
I could build 3 more buildings at Stacks tomorrow and fill them.
Oh.
So we've gone from this sort of, oh my God, the sky's falling, to now demand for new product. And that's what these folks are seeing too. So to transition then, how can I find more sites?
Yeah.
It's very, very hard to find more sites, especially ones that are big. Our belief is that the market these days, it's a lot easier to compete with scale. Having multiple buildings in a park, there's lots of reasons for that, but you can accommodate all these different tenants that may come through. And so we've looked hard for them. We've lost to Scannell on the deluxe site. We've seen some others that were just too expensive. And I think the barriers are, we haven't had a correction in the land price like we had in previous cycles. We bought Stacks in 2013, we closed, but we tied it up in 2011 when all we were doing is watching TARP hearings. And that land was $260 a foot. And you can't find that these days. And the apartment and multifamily is still doing well, industrial is doing well. So the land prices haven't corrected. And the rents, although they've risen, have stayed kind of flat. And we haven't had any cap rate compression like we're seeing in Denver, for example. We're at a 4.25 cap or maybe a 4. We're stuck at 5.5. Judd's going to fix that on the next panel by selling the Prologis portfolio for a 5 or maybe a sub 5. But without that cap rate compression, it's made it hard to afford this more expensive land. And so you're kind of chasing your tail a little bit. And so we're trying to find other sites and maybe use different structures, maybe buy some land, collect some rent for a few years, hammer the basis down, and then maybe you can get a project going. So taking a little different strategy to try and find some infill sites to redevelop.
Thank you, Paul. And to Paul's point, back to that Northern Stacks project, when I was at the city of Fridley, when he worked on that project, I recall too, there's a lot of incentives. So not only in that project, the land cost is cheap, there's a lot of incentives. So we go back to the panel before us about roles of local government, not just in redevelopment sites, but new greenfield sites as well. I know we have a city up in the tech corridor that we've been talking with a couple different groups about, how to get control of that site and what are some of the strategies. And one of them is getting, city ownership there just to kind of control that price because things are moving in the industrial world and all of a sudden it inflates that price point again when the rates are already high enough, trying to get it under control. So again, depends on the city. Some cities don't have the appetite for that aggressive approach to development, but there are some roles that I'm seeing start to make a real difference right now in the market. So Jeff, you mentioned you've got a different perspective on this. What are you seeing in projects from your perspective in architecture, and what are you working on kind of heading into next year that's shifted maybe a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think maybe to reiterate what I had said earlier, what we're seeing is that at least the workload that we have, the things that we're working on, the things that we're tracking on, tend to be more the build-to-suit owned buildings opposed to speculative renting type situations. And I think part of that is that we started seeing that happen pre-COVID. I think there's a lot to be said about, the industrial market in general with e-commerce, everything. It just seems to be, a portion of the work sector that for us has been constant. But specifically as it relates to COVID, what some of the clients that we're meeting with, I think as Nate had said earlier, industrial type buildings and businesses aren't things that we can be doing online. You can't be doing manufacturing via Zoom. So business owners are being very intentional about what can we be doing for staff, for comfort level. And I think there's this, at least with the clients we're working with, there's this conception that, if they own the project, they have a little bit more say into what's going on with it. And, meeting specific needs, if it be, amount of glass on the building or aesthetics. We just wrapped up a project in Chanhassen, and it was a build-to-suit and 50,000 square foot office warehouse building. They had been previously located in Chanhassen, and their number one criteria was how do we retain staff? Not even just current staff, but how do we bring on future staff? So, I know the last panel talked about heat map, and this was number one concern when they're looking for location. They found a site that they could work with. And then every design decision that we made from that point forward was really what's best for staff. And, we've seen that certainly as it relates to more traditional workplace. If we think about, class A, class B office space, this is a transition that we're seeing in the industrial market. I think people are realizing that it's not just going to be a FabCon box going up, that these are, companies are putting a lot more interest in branding these buildings and making, having creature comforts that their staff and employees can enjoy.
So let's touch on then from that point, the spec. We had talked a little bit again ahead of time about what spec development's looking like now in the metro. And I think the point you were all getting across is it's different. I kind of mentioned from my perspective, in economic development, at least in the North Metro, we are seeing a lot of movement in industrial, a lot of big users looking for 50 acres, 100,000 square feet, your distribution, your warehousing, but a lot of them want existing buildings. And that's that push and pull I always mention. It seems like we don't have the inventory, but then we'll turn back and say, but we do have the inventory, and you can't always develop ahead of time from what the users need. So are you seeing a shift in, we can start with you, Josh, because we talked a lot about this. Are you seeing a shift in the needs for spec? Are you seeing kind of the same demand? And what's your approach to that heading into next year?
We haven't seen a shift. I mean, typically you're seeing spec where there's simply not enough supply. And so it's not always that someone sets out looking for spec or brand new. It's just they can't find what they want existing. So no, we think, that we haven't really talked about rental rates yet, but as Paul was alluding to earlier, with land pricing, construction costs, everything else, rents do need to go up for these spec projects to work. And one thing on my mind is while rents have, I would say, flattened or remain flat for the most part through COVID, in some cases, they're even going up. But it's still harder and harder to make the numbers work. So I do think there's going to be a little bit of sticker shock for some people who might think there's still a deal out there because of what we're going through. And, there's a lot of groups that start with, I want to be in the center of the bullseye. I want 32 clear. I want trailers. I want, short-term lease. And it just doesn't exist. So you just, as always, you start working out where your concentric circles and realize like, no, you can't just buy it. And no, it's not 8 and 4, and it's kind of the same old stuff. So I think we're going to see more of that next year. And I'd love to listen to Phil because they've got a nice project in Golden Triangle where I know they're aiming to set a new watermark for rental rate. So
Yeah, well, we're gonna have to because I mean, like at the end of the day, I mean, and Paul touched on. I think we're all saying this. I mean, the land price is about the one variable you
It's the
can
only thing.
toggle. It's the only. I mean, the cost to put a
Right.
building up in Eden Prairie versus Egan versus you name it is the same. Some have different requirements for finishes or type 1 materials, but at the end of the day, that's not
Fees.
going to be the driver. It's really going to come down to what can you get on that land price. And I agree with what Paul's saying is that we haven't seen that land reset because the mini storage groups, for instance, I mean, they'll come in and they'll just because they can
Yeah.
get vertical density. And, people say, well, when's 2-story industrial coming to Minnesota? And it's like,
Never.
not anytime soon. So, but well, I do think, to Josh's point as well, is that people that want to go out there and own, if they're buying a building that makes sense for the numbers, there's probably something wrong with the building. And I don't mean that like it's a scare tactic. I'm just saying, if it's a good building, you're not selling it for a discount. It has to be a really unique set of circumstances for that to take place, especially with an industrial building. If you had an industrial building that was in an infill location with a bunch of outside storage, by way of example, you can't even do that anymore in a lot of municipalities. So if you're grandfathered in, that's not going to sell. And if it does sell, it's going to be for a significant premium above. I mean, you wouldn't be able to make sense of this per square foot price. So all of those ingredients, I think, go into saying a couple of things. A, the space markets have been held in check. Some of it is from institutional controls where you just can't find the right sites at a price that makes sense. And then the other is that I think as the development community continues to look at it saying, we don't want to get into a hyper supply type situation. And part of that is just because of that self-governing, again, that you can't find those good infill sites. And the good infill sites that you can find, you're either paying a premium for, like we did in Eden Prairie, or B, it's going to have some hair on it where I know groups like Paul's thrive, but I mean, we are redeveloping the former dump site up in Maple Grove. And we talk a little bit about incentives. That was a big sticker shock when we talked with the city saying, this is not an asset, this is a liability because the cleanup costs so greatly exceed any fair market price of the land, it will never work. However, in a combination of TIF, we had environmental cleanup grants, and we basically, in lieu of paying a market price for the land, we paid $1 for the land, but then we ended up having to absorb the additional cleanup. So after $6.5 million plus or minus dollars to get the site ready, we haven't even put a shovel in the ground and put a footing in. There's now a building there today. None of that would have happened though had it not been for the public-private partnership in that instance. And we've enjoyed success there with it being basically, I mean, we got an end cap space of like 13,000 feet that's left. So it's a long rambling of saying the space markets are continuing to push and drive for those solutions. And the reality being, if you have a big land position that you own, you have to have a balance sheet like a Duke to be able to hold it for a long period of time. Even then, land eats every single day. So if land's not put in production, it's a burden on the balance sheet.
And I want to ask, so when did you start that project, Maple Grove? Like inception to completion?
Yeah. So we started, that's a great question. So to put that into context, if you were to say, I mean, of all the different asset categories that we work in, the life cycle of an industrial deal is hands down the fastest. From the time that you had the idea to when you get it entitled, closed, built, stabilized. I mean, just the absorption and the speed of how quickly that happens is a fraction of a senior, by way of example, on the other end of the spectrum, senior housing project that is. So at Maple Grove, we started working on that in collaboration with our partners, Inland Development partners, my former boss, Tom Shaver, who's there. So it was somewhat fulfilling if he's listening. I think he's out actually hunting pheasants right now, but I said, Tom, you're no longer my boss. Now we're peers on this one. But anyway, we started in early 2018 with the Inland had secured a lot of the environmental grants. We started going through the entitlement phase. We ended up closing December of 2018, and we did 6 months of cleanup. And then we found some stuff that was in the dump site that, despite all of the pocket marking that we did to try to find it, we found some stuff that took some more time to figure out what it was. We figured that out, and we effectively are now I think we got our certificate of occupancy for the Shell building in September. So you do that rough math, it's 20 months from start to finish. And we had an extended lease up period. So we were able to get leasing done while we were still under construction. Now we have 2 tenants that are in there right now that basically took almost all the building. And then maybe just anecdotally, though, I will say that anytime you start getting into the environmental arena, there's a lot of time that goes into it. There's a lot of expense that goes into it, monitoring. Obviously, you've got a lot of those grants there to do it, but pretty quickly, it no longer is just a simple little box with a couple of FabCon panels around it. It's a pretty sophisticated environment that you're generating with an active mitigation system and all of the testings and the checks and balances to make sure at the end of the day, you're delivering that Class A product that has that Class A environment for all the occupants inside the building.
So gentlemen, on the end, from a different perspective, what are you seeing, with spec or build to suit projects that you've been involved in? And what is your company's focus headed into next year?
I can weigh in quick. I think, next year, I mentioned not spec, not build to suit yet. And part of that is time of delivery. So a lot of the projects we're looking at now, especially outer metro, have either triggered a mandatory EAW threshold. So if you're in the Class 2 city, that's 20,000 to 100,000 people, and it takes 450,000 square feet of light industrial to trip that. That's typically a 4-month process. And then you stack on top of that wetlands, which we see now going out into, say, the Dayton area with the Dayton Parkway coming online. We're seeing a lot of activity out there. And then more, I say, niche, it feels like products down in Chaska, Chanhassen, but wetlands. And same thing with the Anoka County site in Blaine, Artis Reed, wetlands, floodplain, landscape violets, everything. So you're stacking all these approvals. So in order to get to a point, I feel, and these guys can speak better to this, but the point where civil hands it off is the point where I feel like it becomes a real project where people see the potential that, okay, you're able to build something here. Does the market want, can I just roll the dice and do spec, or is there someone knocking at my door who says, tweak this, change that, let's do a build to suit? But for us, it feels like there was definitely a pause this spring, and now we're loading the pipeline with those types of approvals going forward. So I would say of the projects that I know of that are targeting 21, there might be one or two confirmed build to suits, and the rest are hopefully turning into build to suit, but they're not there yet. They're not ready because they're not entitled.
Tied up in approvals.
Yes.
Sure. What about you, Jeff?
I would say when I had mentioned I have a different perspective, it's more, I meant that more in the sense of what we're working on. But I will say we last year we did work on a speculative warehousing project down in Cottage Grove, and 120,000 square foot. And but in our office, we're referring to it's on a COVID hold, meaning that the drawings are done and the site was ready to be built this summer, but we're waiting. But that, in that circumstance, the client understands and realizes the same thing that I think we're all understanding, that industrial products changing in terms of expectations of what users are expecting. And it was, we spent considerable time in terms of the aesthetic of the building, and knowing that to be competitive, in that circumstance, they are competing with the notion of somebody going out and building their own building. So they need it to have the feel and the look that their end users are expecting. So in that regards, I think we're in alignment with what these guys are saying.
So let's talk about those users a little bit. We're touching on more of the investment side, and let's talk about who's driving the market right now. So obviously industrial is doing well, but who industrial are you seeing a lot of? For instance, and in my role, I've seen a lot of companies that are in med tech, right? Obviously with what's going on, they're hitting a boom, depending on what sector they are in med tech. But then you're also seeing obviously distribution, e-commerce. What about some of your smaller industrial users? What are they doing? What's the activity? Are they shrinking down in space? Are they demanding new space? What are you seeing a lot of activity in right now?
A lot of our projects are more in the what I'd call light manufacturing production. And again, I think it goes back to this notion of meeting the needs of the users inside. Somebody on one of the earlier panels who talked about some of the older product where you have less desirable lighting, just the feel of the interior isn't necessarily what they're hoping to achieve. And so those are things that we're looking at when we're looking at these spaces. You know, how do we make it an environment that these folks who are essential workers can come in every day, feel comfortable, you know, feel that they're being productive and that they're in a lively space that's new and modern, and that they're not in a space that's outdated.
Sure. And Paul, have you seen that with the shifts? And obviously you mentioned you lost a pretty large tenant there, but it's already backfilled. What kind of tenants are looking at that space?
Yeah, I guess, starting at the top, like we've got some big projects in Denver, and you're seeing the biggest of the big companies, Lowe's, Home Depot, FedEx, Amazon, of course, Walmart, Kroger's, and they're out looking to build the infrastructure to keep pace with this new COVID online economy. And we had seen it, and we only talked about it around the holidays, but there's been a paradigm shift. And you could hear these folks say, well, we did more in March than we ever did in December. And they're trying now to build the infrastructure to keep up with that. They haven't been able to keep up. And now everybody's expectations, I expect to be able to buy a snowblower online and have it show up at my door. So they're all out, and those are the biggest companies with the most capital.
Yeah.
So they're crushing it right now,
Yeah.
and they're going to smash their smaller competitors. And then, and so we're trying to take advantage of that with some of the big projects we've got in Denver with 1 million foot buildings. I see some of the smaller folks slugging it out, sitting on their hands, just trying to keep going. And then you're seeing some in between stuff where food groups, freezer cooler users, all now coming into the market. That is a capacity that now can't be served by existing product. So there's a big change in the typical tenants that we're seeing active in this time from what we'd seen in the past. And somebody said, well, aren't you just buying forward what would happen in 21 or 22? And absolutely not. This is a very different environment. And some of those small and medium folks will start to catch up when they feel more comfortable. But I think we're setting the table for the next cycle in this environment. And that's why we're trying to find more sites to be ready for it.
Well, and I think you're talking to a point of, this is kind of a long-term trend now. A lot of people, I think when this pandemic first hit, were like, it's a short-term problem. It's not going to affect long-term. It is a long-term effect. Because if you think about your personal habits, I always say 21 days, you create new habits. So now we've all used Zoom. We've all used all these online grocery shopping, ordering platforms. Now you're used to it. So when things do go back to normal, call it a different normal, your behaviors are the ones that are driving these activities. And those behaviors probably aren't going to change back, not to a full extent. So we are going to see this continuation. It might not be to the scale you're seeing it right now, but I think what we're seeing today is that scale is at its peak right now, and we'll probably continue on that, but it won't go away. You know what I mean? It's going to be there, that demand for that last mile cold storage space for your grocers, and obviously Home Depot of the world's now having to sell snowblowers online. That wasn't really a thing before COVID. So we are seeing those shifts in users. We had talked about too as a group, the users that were typically demanding, maybe your lower end industrial space, they were your warehouse kind of, quick turn and burn product distribution centers. You had mentioned, Paul, that those users have now left those spaces and have gone into much larger spaces that maybe typically they couldn't afford before. What trend, is that the same users that are demanding that space?
Yeah, we're talking about the 3PL folks who the developers never really liked because they pay $3.50 and they want a 6-month deal. It looks good on the prospect list when they need 100,000 feet, but then you dig a little deeper and you're like, yeah, this sucks. Can't do this deal. Can't finance it.
Yeah.
Well, we've seen some of those folks now have to pay up because they need the space to keep up with the COVID.
Yeah.
And so we've got somebody that stores cardboard boxes and $350, 6 months. Well, they signed a 5-year deal at 5.25. And I'm like, that's never happened. So that's been some of the paradigm shift as well that we're seeing with some of the 3PL users.
I was going to add, so I sit on a group of 20 market leaders for Duke. We're in the top 20 U.S. industrial markets in the country. And so we talk about this a lot. And after e-commerce, 3PL is
Yep.
the second largest driver, not just in the country, but also here. We're seeing more and more of that. And the groups I was alluding to earlier that start with the center of the bullseye and want 6 months is exactly what you're talking about. We actually just had a run-in with one where, once we figured out who they were and what their contracts were with their clients, it changed things. But it's happening all across the country. This pandemic has only accelerated the death of retail, or I should say brick and mortar retail. It was coming anyway, but this all just accelerated it. And the one thing I'd add too is it's not the small and medium-sized tenants for industrial. I don't think they're as in trouble as some might think. It's just they have to adjust how they're going about their business and their supply chain. It may be selling their product online through Amazon as opposed to their own, and let the big boys handle the distribution channels. I think there's, we haven't talked about it a lot, but we've talked about scale, we've talked about infill, but I still think there's a sweet spot for these 5 to 10 acre sites where you're building 75,000 to 125,000 feet, similar to what Phil's putting up in Eden Prairie. And, that's not necessarily where these large companies are going. It's still the local and regional companies that need, 25 to 50,000 square feet. So that's still the big piece of our market.
And maybe just to piggyback on that, I think it's an excellent point, is that the chemistry of our marketplace, I do think still is somewhat similar, where when we, for instance, when we talk with on a national level, you think about, hey, it's all going to be these 500,000 square foot, 32 to 36, maybe 40 foot clear.
Right.
25,000 square foot, 24 foot clear product
Right.
is extremely viable in this market and continues to be, because of we're just not the same level of distribution. 24 to 28 foot clear is more than functional. And, that a lot of that's kind of the bread and butter. And I think, in that 75 to 125,000 square feet, like Josh just mentioned, I mean, that's the type of product, particularly that infill size, that's going to do extremely well. Is it going to get the headlines of doing a 500,000 square foot?
Right.
No, it's not. Is it super exciting? No, but is there a depth of market for what the tenant profile wants? Absolutely. And as you look at the long-term space markets and the demand drivers for those, we talked about it, that labor experience, the war on talent is no more prevalent in the industrial arena than it is anywhere else. If anything, it's heightened right now because nobody's using the office spaces right now. I mean, downtown Minneapolis is at 10% occupancy, if that. But industrial space is being used on a daily basis. Putting in clear story lights, adding in outdoor amenity, be it a walking trail, be it picnic tables. Things that you think of in the office arena have permeated themselves in the industrial arena. And now it is no longer a differentiator. It is the ante that you have to have,
Yep.
in my humble opinion, to be competitive in the marketplace. And yes, some of those anecdotal items about where does the CEO live, all that stuff does still come into play. But when that decision maker is going into the building, two things I think are happening in the market right now that I think are noteworthy. A, there's been a huge consolidation of ownership, which like we've never seen in this market before. What that does is provide for concentration of purchase pricing and setting the market. So all of us all of us developers, I think, are all enjoying the fact that there has started to become a right sizing, if you will, of the rents. But within that is, I'll go up with new construction against something that's 20 years old any day of the week. Because when a decision maker walks in and looks at brand new construction with clear story windows, painted all white on the inside, such a more welcoming experience as opposed to that 16 to 18 foot clear, low lit, not LED lighting. We're going to win that hands down, even if the face rate is another $1 a square foot.
So labor, I mean, we talked about this, the panel before us in economic development, I think earlier before that as well, we talked a little bit on labor, but it is a real driver. I can give you an example. There's a company in Fridley that the broker was looking for space for a while for them because they're growing and they have Texas operations. That's their distribution channel. So they're manufacturing here, distribution in Texas. That happened over an acquisition of that distribution center, which was their only distributor. They were going to go out of business. Long story short, they're saying, well, let's move to Texas. They had a brand new facility down there. Labor is much easier access. At least there's a lot more call it migration into Texas right now than Minnesota. And our unemployment rate prior to COVID was very, very low. But we had a conversation with the ownership team and the broker, and I just explained, locally what the resources were for hiring. And it was a much different story then, because they were saying, well, wait a second. Yeah, we can get 30 people off the street in Dallas, but they're not very skilled. And it's kind of a free for all. Yeah, I'm getting 30, but I'm rehiring 30 of those every 6 months. And so their building was great. Their lease rates were great. They had access to labor, but it wasn't quality labor, and it wasn't the partnership they needed. They chose their location and moved all of those 50 employees to Minnesota, found a new location further north based off of labor. And so not just local labor, obviously you're mentioning, sometimes we look at our markets like being on the 94 corridor, being on those corridors are obviously an access to the labor market, but also nationally, it's becoming more important. And even if you look at what's happening with COVID, we have unemployment, but it's not in manufacturing. It's in your retail sector. So these industrial tenants that you're working with are still having that big mindful presence of where am I going to be closest to my labor so I can continue to grow. So I'm seeing it as a continuation of that, if not a worse and a heightened, because they just can't get people to go into that skilled workforce, or some of them aren't skilled. Distribution maybe isn't a skilled job, but they need people to move products. So again, something to keep in mind that is driving the industrial market, at least from a tenant side. So let's kind of finish up here with a different perspective on site selection. When you are looking either for a tenant on build to suit, or when you are looking for new projects. Obviously, we're mentioning it's tough to get the price points, but besides that, what are other important factors? We talked about shovel readiness a little bit on the call. In your mind, what is the most important factor of that shovel readiness on a site right now? Start with any of you, maybe down on the end from an engineering perspective.
Most important is who's going to hire me. No, what we're seeing in all seriousness is access to I-35 or I-94. And then is there a local demand for expansion like Housesack Park? It was Eden Trace developed that because they had some incubators right there and they wanted to graduate some of their guys into another facility right across the road, had a relationship with the sellers, was able to work through, I think, some of the added costs on developing that site. So, those, I guess, are a couple of the things that we're seeing secondhand. We're not in the room with these guys talking to the users, though.
I think I would echo that. I think the majority of the time that we're working with clients and they're thinking about location, it is all about access. And, we've already talked about the, employees and staff, but also about the, if they're, depending on what their business is, it's the distribution of goods or the intake of goods, and where is that coming from, and how does that affect their business? And so there's a lot of factors that go into that. Clearly, if the site's viable and shovel ready, that's great. But we've looked at sites with clients that aren't, because the location is so important that we're dealing with things that maybe it's not the most ideal in terms of soils corrections, or there's wetland mitigation and things that kind of get messy, and all of a sudden what you thought was going to be quite a large site of buildable area, once we've looked at it, you're reduced to about half buildable area, but nonetheless it's the right location.
Sure. And before we jump into Paul, I'm going to point out, I think Scott Crawford is from Crawford Mertz here. Scott Thompson, he did a project up in Centerville, and that's a good example of location. So that was a user that was in Minneapolis for years. How many years? Maybe 50? Yeah, 30 plus. And when they needed a new site, they outgrew. I think Scott was part of that team. Even though they're now 25 minutes north, they said they have better access because they are a heavy equipment supplier, distributor, and they do repairs. And so getting that equipment in and out of Minneapolis didn't work for them anymore. So we are seeing that trend with the location to actually go the opposite way of, you would think, not coming further into Minneapolis for access to the market, but depending on what that user is, further out just for ease of business and getting that, again, prime site that is priced affordably and also has less issues, whether it's outdoor storage issues, redevelopment issues, you name it. So we'll jump over to Paul and kind of jump off of Jeff's thoughts here.
Yeah, I'd say something different. I'd say it matters a lot who your city is. That can make or break the deal. Phil was talking about it. We've seen some cities, which I will not name, that essentially said, we're too busy to deal with this stuff, or we don't want to deal with grants or TIF or, we're cruising along just fine. And we found in places like Brooklyn Center and Fridley, communities that really needed this tax base and these jobs. And they were partners, and they took risks with TIF and grants that helped the project kick off and come alive. And without that kind of cooperation, our deals aren't going to start. So I'd say pick your communities very carefully.
I think it's very well said. Brady referenced it earlier. City of Cottage Grove, we did the expansion for Renault by Anderson, and I mean, I am not exaggerating. It was lightning speed as far as getting from inception through approvals and getting a shovel in the ground. I mean, it was a quintessential example as to that partnership with the municipality as really coming together and creating a better solution than you could have otherwise. And probably the only other thing, if you were to say, I mean, each deal is unique, so you can't really apply a one size fits all. But as it comes to picking build-to-suit sites, yes, you have to have the access. Yes, you have to have, the scale that you can support the requirement. The one thing I will say, and I think it's not only something today, but it's going to be something that's going to continue forward in the future. And I think Brady hit on it as well, as the more variables that you can knock down in collaboration with the city, as well as all the other regulatory agencies, the better I think you're going to have the audience of that, particularly on a build-to-suit user. If speed to market is important to them, and you're having to sell around, wow, I haven't done the AER yet, but we can figure that out. Or there's the wetland delineation, but we can figure that out. Or I got to still get through the Corps of Engineers. I just, the site selectors are sitting there saying, nope. If the common denominator, if you have the entitlements done, you are absolutely going to separate yourself. And the deed certified shovel ready, Excel program, any one of those is a great catalyst for saying you do legitimately have a site that's ready to do it. And Josh, I would use your example and success up in Maple Grove, where Amazon doesn't wait around for you to kind of do your homework and figure out how to get there, right? It's either, are you ready? If you're not, I'm on to the next. And that's about as long as, I have a better chance of explaining things to my 2 5-year-old twin boys about how things work than I do to explain to Amazon how I'm going to get them there. Because if I have A, B, or C wrong with the site.
Yeah. Well, their motto is to, speed to their customers. So they turn around and say, speed to us, developer. We need to know, A, do you control it? Is it owned? Is it entitled? All those things. And, we're fortunate to have a strong enough balance sheet and an existing portfolio where we can afford to carry some land. So we've taken it even one step further at Park 81, and we actually built a pad for a 300,000 square foot building. So, that puts us, 2 months ahead of the next group just by having it owned, entitled, pad ready. We literally have a building permit ready to be picked up. So speed to market's huge. The one thing I was going to add, and I was thinking about whether I wanted to say it or not, but with all of the desire from developers, not only people who actually know how to develop industrial, but people who don't know how to develop industrial, there's pressure on property owners for what to do. So it's not just the price, but it's close in 30 days and no, I can't give you extent. It's like, well, okay, but I don't know what the other guys are telling you, but you need to get your wetlands delineated and get approval from the LGU to do so. You're going to need to get it rezoned. There's a lot of stuff out there, and there's one of the challenges we're facing now is there are a lot of newcomers who are, I would say, kind of overpromising, and it's making it hard for not just us, but to me, the property owners, because they know what they have, but they may not always realize that there's actually quite a bit of work and risk that the developer takes on to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 6 to 12 months as more and more people decide they want to be industrial developers.
Interesting. And so we talked about the shovel readiness. You probably have all heard about the tech corridor. I've spoken on panels on that. That's exactly what that whole partnership represents, is just making a corridor more shovel ready, branding it, kind of putting that information forward instead of waiting for a project to come around, poke at a site, figure out, yep, you get so far, and then you hit that roadblock. What are those roadblocks? So we basically picked apart every site, 1,000 acres in that corridor, and said, who are the owners? What are the roadblocks? Backtrack into it. We use, data centers as a point of conversation because there's a market for that, but that's not the only market. We're seeing distribution United Properties had control of that site up where Distribution Alternatives building was, and that's in the tech corridor. Again, there's a market for that, but if you look at a data center's requirements for shovel readiness, it's probably about the highest requirement. So if you can satisfy their requirements and checking off all of their boxes on a site selector request, most likely you can get another industrial user's requirements selected, and that's worked. We've got a medical device and we've got another distribution company looking in that corridor. They still need fiber. They still need to know, how much internet and power is available in the rate. So again, all of those conversations, super relevant. Economic developers' role, cities' roles. I can tell you the North Metro cities won't turn you away. Fridley's good. But you're right. I mean, there's certain challenges and you have to understand the politics behind each one. So I think we're past our time. I'm looking at our queue here. Do we have questions or should we wrap up?
Well, what's the building?
It depends. Yeah.
Because if it's a large building and if there's any type of environment, asbestos or anything like that, I mean, so much of that is unique. And at the end of the day, I think Josh said it well, but I think I'd draw a parallel to that. Users want top of market pricing, but they want it right away. And I'm like, well, which one do you want? If you want it right away, you're not going to get top of market pricing because we're assuming that risk. But if you want to get top of market pricing, then you have to go through the due diligence. We have to make sure it's zoned. In a case like that, you have to do a property condition assessment, a hazmat assessment to figure out what it's going to be. And I think demolition, if there was a demo person here, they could talk more, but I know that we saw the articles that happened along Lake Street as far as how expensive the demolition was. Demolition is it's expensive. Any way you look at it. I mean, the likelihood of it being an older, functionally obsolete building is much higher. And I contend, probably just about all of us sitting here on the panel would love to figure out ways that you could buy an existing industrial building or two, scrape it and put a new one up. But I don't think the math ever works as much as we've been talking about land pricing here. If you have anything that has any type of income that's being generated, forget it. Industrial's not going to work.
We demolished 9 industrial buildings at the former Lehigh Hansen site in Maple Grove, the one I keep referring to as Park 81. But I tell you, I've got metrics for just about every cost of my projects. Demo is not one of them. So I always send someone out to get a number because it just really varies by the project.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. This was a great panel of experts, and I appreciate everyone taking the time with us today, online and in person.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job.